So if you have come from TikTok, from my video where I talk about Steve Laws, then you already know the headline claim. If you haven't, let's talk about Steve Laws' interview on the Andrew Goldstein podcast recently. Now, they go into great lengths. Both of them are nationalists, but Steve Law is an ethno-nationalist. Andrew Goldstein is more of a civic nationalist. But Steve Laws says some really uncomfortably disgusting things, some really uneducated things, and they go into dark authoritarian territory. He believes England belongs to the fixed ethnic group called the English, and this group finished forming at some undefined point in history. Now, what I wanted to do with this video is take his argument seriously just for a moment, reconstruct it properly, and then test it against what we already know from history, what we already know from anthropology. Because when you do that, his whole argument, it doesn't just fall apart, it doesn't just fail, it doesn't just collapse, it proves what kind of level of fragility these kind of men utilise. So, Steve Laws, he is not saying ethnicity is fake. He is saying the opposite. He argues that the English are a real, distinct ethnic group formed over centuries through mixing of earlier groups. And he describes that process through Angles, through Saxons, the Vikings, and the Norman conquest as ethnogenesis. So far, this is not fringe. This is broadly how historians describe identity formation. The key move comes next, because he starts arguing that this process is now complete and it must not continue, and that new groups joining would not be evolution, but replacement. And this is the hinge everything turns on, and this is why it gets darker. There is no point in recorded history where an ethnic group formally closes. It just doesn't happen anywhere in the world. Because ethnic identity, it's not a club with a locked door. Unfortunately for Steve Laws, it is an ongoing social process. We know that maps are changing over centuries, that shifts in language, in marriage patterns, in legal changes. The English identity has absorbed Norman elites. It's absorbed Vikings, Scandinavian settlers. It's absorbed Celtic neighbours, and then later internal migration from across Britain. Not because people voted on it or anything like that, but because that's how human societies work. So when Steve Laws says the process must stop now, he is not making a historical claim. He is making an authoritarian political demand, because he repeatedly uses time as a moral filter. Ancient mixing is unacceptable. Modern mixing is unacceptable. But time, it doesn't change the mechanism. People moving, people settling, people marrying and raising children, it does not become illegitimate because trains exist. If time alone legitimizes identity, then every ethnic group on Earth is illegitimate at some earlier point. There is no arbitrary year you can point to and say, because this identity formation is valid, after it becomes corruption. The stop line is not historical, Steve Laws. It is emotional. Institutions do not reproduce themselves in a vacuum. Lawman law did not arrive as a PDF. It arrived through families and power and marriage and inheritance. This was 1,000 years ago. Here's what I will say to Steve Laws. If culture changes, but people supposedly do not, what exactly is being preserved here, Steve? At what point does ethnicity become an aesthetic label and not a lived social reality? Because once you declare identity closed, the next question, if Steve had power, is enforcement. And of course, someone like Steve Laws is unusually honest about this. This requires constant monitoring of ancestry. It requires the state to decide which families count. Steve would require children to inherit status based on blood. And that is not a side effect. That is the system that Steve Laws would want to build if he was in power. So even if you agreed with every premise that Steve Laws puts on the table, this project, it cannot stabilise. There is no final purge. There is no final moment where the state stops checking. Identity policing, it always turns inward. And history is crystal clear about what happens next. This is why ideas like this matter, even when the people promoting them are fringe. Because people like Steve Laws, they show us how quickly identity talk turns into power talk.